Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
Coming to you from these United States of America here in Eastertide. Bud, he is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Alleluia, alleluia. Wonderful to be with you here on Iowa Catholic Radio on The Uncommon Good. You probably know me as the guy who you hear in the morning with Bo Bonner on the Catholic Morning Show here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, where do the good folks know you?
So I am Dean down at Mercy College of Health Sciences in downtown Des Moines.
Wonderful time of year. Bud, did you have Easterling things that happened that made you go, this is about as cool as Imogene Ingredients, who we want to say thank you for underwriting our show.
Yes, thank you, Imogene. We were in Nebraska for Easter, and one of my daughters made a comment. I think it was really true. At least in Nebraska, it was very apropos weather for the weekend. So Good Friday was very dreary, cold and rainy. It felt like an appropriate Good Friday. But then Easter, things warmed up a bit, and there was a lot of sunshine and joy all the way around.
Yeah, we had a very interesting wind that picked up on the vigil that made me wonder, like always, if things were going to catch on fire with the Easter fire. But they did not. And again, yes, Sunday, a beautiful day. Wonderful to be able to hang out with the family. I hope everybody had an appropriately wonderful time as well. But on the show, we're going to continue with our Leadership Reconsidered. We're going to say in some ways this is part 2 of Skin in the Game, but particularly by talking about sacrificial leadership. What we want to say is the idea and the theology of sacrifice, and how that actually, as a concept, helps us understand the difference Jesus Christ makes in leadership studies. Some more of that to come on the show. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. But just to frame the topic, of course, we are rolling along with our Leadership Reconsidered series. We've covered many a great things, how leadership in a different key begins and ends with Jesus Christ and his life. We think of the Philippian hymn, kenosis, the self-emptying aspect of Christ's leadership, which we experienced in spades because we had Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and then, of course, his resurrection we celebrated with Easter. Connecting with prior themes, it's important to think about how we want to make people anti-fragile. We don't want to be fragile in our leadership or make people fragile in their following of us. Anti-fragility is not just resisting change or difficulty. It's actually learning to make even difficulty and error the seat of how we grow and improve both as leaders and the people that we govern. Finally, we talked about skin in the game, and on one hand, Bud, we literally meant the idea best incorporated in the Code of Hammurabi, where if you made a building, you had to live on the first floor to show that the upside of the benefits you shared with people, but you'd also share the downside. So, for instance, if you cut corners, the building would fall on you as well. No one has exemplified this aspect of skin in the game more than God himself in Jesus Christ, becoming incarnate, sharing in our difficulties, dying a death like ours, and then rising to share the benefits of his new life. There is nothing that Jesus does not ask of us that he himself did not face. That truly is skin in the game. So, Bud, we want to talk about how when we think about skin in the game, obvious ways that we get this again once more from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. We want to tip our hat to his book, Anti-Fragility, where he really does talk about this. He also has a further book called Skin in the Game where he gets into this as well. But we want to say that we think this is firmly entrenched in Christian theology, and that actually where you see that, so yes, the incarnation and just Jesus Christ himself, but maybe to give context and a wider understanding of this, is the necessity of sacrifice itself. Sacrifice is a multivalent term. It's used in all sorts of contexts. Just in the church, we think of the sacrifice of the Mass, the sacrifice of the cross, personal sacrifice, right? Bud, you made a sacrifice to come down here and record this show with me. But of course, other cultures, other religions have sacrifice, and there's plenty of negative connotations about sacrifice, right? That, you sacrifice an animal, or that it has to do with paganism and things like this. So, Bud, you've actually written on this in multiple arenas, and so I feel like we really benefit from your expertise here. Let's get at the heart of sacrifice And if you remember, we also talked about apophatic leadership. What is leadership not? Let's start with what sacrifice itself is not. One false reduction you hear in the modern world is that sacrifice is just merely destruction. So why is it that doesn't get at the sort of basic structure of sacrifice, even in cultures and religions not ours?
Well, I'm really glad, Bo, that you kind of paused or slowed down this series to dedicate an entire episode to sacrifice, because I think this is central to the biblical vision. It's near and dear to my heart as someone who became Catholic later in life. You know, growing up evangelical Protestant, we would talk about offering a sacrifice of praise, but things sort of stopped there at the sacrifice of praise. Of course, for Catholics, there's a much more tangible, sacramental understanding of sacrifice. And I think it goes back to the very beginning of Scripture. So even before sin, I think we forget this, like Adam and Eve have kind of a priestly function. Certainly directly after sin, you know, Cain and Abel, the real turning point in that story is like the sacrifice of Abel that God finds acceptable. But you're right, it's a multivalent term. By multivalent, like even different meanings in Scripture. So we see sacrifices of thanksgiving, sacrifices of propitiation. Certainly the Passover sacrifice, the feasting with the lamb who was sacrificed, that was to establish a kind of communion with God. But I think, Bo, when we think about what's kind of the proper understanding of sacrifice, or what do we have in mind when we think about leadership, I go back to Hebrews 9, and the author there says that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And there's something kind of mysterious about that. Like we ask the question, like, why would God require the shedding of blood? But for me, it goes back to, Bo, if we think about the nature of love, that in this world as it was created, I think love always involves a certain level of pathos. We think, of course, of the love of a mother, what takes place when she bears a child in the womb, certainly during the labor process. And then as Christians, we say that God revealed himself climactically, like most fully at the cross. So there's something paradoxical there, that God's love was expressed in its fullest measure, not through like this brute exercise of power, but the Son of God like willfully taking on aspersions and suffering and a death that he didn't deserve. So it's central to the mystery of the faith. It's central to our understanding of who God is. And we are leaders. We embody love in our own lives insofar as we're kind of drawn into that reality.
Well, I think that when people have negative associations with sacrifice, it's easy to think that, or maybe to even focus on the destruction of sacrifice.
Yeah.
If it's an animal, you burn it up. Jesus, expired on the cross. When we think of a personal sacrifice, there's always this idea, well, I could have been doing something. I could have been having a milkshake. I could have been taking a nap. And instead, I have destroyed the possibilities of me having the pet lamb, sleeping on the couch, and instead I'm doing whatever. And if you really do focus on waste or exhaustion, or let's be honest, a real word that plagues a lot of leadership is burnout, not only of people that are being led, but leaders, it can make it sound like, Bud, what we want is people to sort of have like a death race for 2 years as a leader and then die of a heart attack, and then we need a new leader. And we're not trying in any way to get at that, but that also shows a sort of modern worry about sacrifice itself. To your point, I think there are people who quite naturally would sort of rear back hearing what Hebrews says about blood.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, people will, of course, realize deep in their heart that sacrifice has to be had, for instance, if you want to be physically fit, right? You're going to go ruin a Saturday running down a street because you're in a marathon. You're going to make your feet hurt. You're going to maybe fall and scrape your knee, and there'll be blood. There's all sorts of things people realize that if you want something good, you have to sacrifice, which in a basic way is just to say, in order to do X, you often have to decide not to do Y and Z. And in many ways, right? To make one choice in your life is to exclude many other possibilities that you could have done. So on one hand, just philosophically, it's not the destruction, as it were, it's the choice. I'm making a specific choice, and I'm taking something that like I could have done, and I'm only doing one thing instead.
Yeah.
With theologically considered, though, there's this idea that sacrifice is a participation in divine life, which this gets into blood, which I'm going to turn back over to you in a second. But I think what's really important there is to understand if there is something like, so grace perfecting nature, philosophy being perfected by theology, but if there's something that's good enough to give up your weekend and allow your feet to get hurt over because it's good to run and be in shape, if there's a supererogatory good, a good above all others, and let's name this good God, but what wouldn't you sacrifice to have life with the love that moves the planets and the stars, as Dante says? And so even the sort of pagan or Israelite sacrifices of animals, I always like to point out to people, when you sacrifice a lamb in the ancient world, you're not only saying, I'm taking like the best possession I might have, because livestock, resource intensive, central to the economies and the sociology of an ancient society, but to take the best unblemished lamb is to fart away like multiple generations of good lambs, because you're taking away one that you would presumably breed to make better ones. And so when you start to say, I am going to take my greatest and my highest and give it to God, especially since it's propitiatory, I'm not taking my child, for instance, or sacrificing, immolating myself. So I'm going to take a symbolic thing that shows this is my livelihood, but I regard God higher than even this high thing. This is actually less about destruction and about life and choosing life and choosing what's most important. And when God allows sacrifices, for instance, in the Old Testament, he's allowing what we want to say is a sacramental-like idea, right? God doesn't want you to destroy your life by offering yourself in sacrifice. So what is it that you will sacrifice in its stead in order to have life with God? And this is where blood comes in.
Yeah, I think you're right that destruction is not quite the correct term. I kind of hesitate there because there is an element of that, and I think a better word might be to waste. And so, like, at Mass, in a certain sense, we waste our time, right? We offer it towards a different end. Sometimes there was a stage in my life where at Mass, I would sometimes like try to read devotional literature, and I saw that as sort of cutting against the grain of what the Mass was about, because I was trying to sort of effectively use the time, right?
Yeah. By the world standards.
Yeah. And I should have done the homework here, but I think in the Old Testament, there's even one of the sacrifices where the directive is that the offering has to be consumed completely.
Holocaust.
It can't be eaten. It has to be burnt up.
Burnt offering.
A whole burnt offering, right? And so there's a piece to that, but I think you're right. And part of it, Bo, to me is what's the orientation of that sort of quote unquote wasting or destruction. So in other cultures, this was sometimes misunderstood, where there were actually human sacrifices, and the idea was that this person would be destroyed to sort of appease the gods, right? And you can kind of see how there's that impulse, but it's a misunderstanding of what the divine would ask for. Certainly when Abraham goes to offer Isaac, that's a key moment in the Old Testament. And going back to Hebrews, it tells us that Abraham was willing to make that offering because he believed that God was even able to bring Isaac back from the dead. So Abraham, in that moment, he's brought to a recognition that God doesn't want the total destruction of his son, but that his son is offered towards a different end. And that's where I think, even when we use the term loosely, like there's a destructive element, that something precious is like the life is drained from it. It's oriented towards a life-giving character. And without the resurrection, this is where St. Paul is completely like hits it on the head. The death of Christ would be something that's like sort of meaningless or
worse.
Yes. Yeah. That we would be the most to be pitied if we looked back to that event apart from the resurrection.
Well, and I actually think the analog that stands between the philosophical and the theological is actually eating. So in order for your life to exist, my friends, something has to die. So even if you are a vegetarian, you can't eat plastic and survive. Like, you have to take at least vegetation and kill it in order for it to be, masticated by your teeth, to say chewing in a much cooler way, allow that to go down your gullet and then be broken down, right, in order for its parts to be used for the sustenance of your body. When we further add that we know that we are not simply bodies, but we're bodies and souls, but then you start to realize that there's this strange way that the broccoli on your plate is the storehouse of energy that allows your mitochondria to allow you to offer your prayers. And so weirdly enough, broccoli dies and is broken apart, literally in your gut, but ends up to the higher end of offering a prayer. When you eat an animal, strange as it might seem, that animal's life is used to power your body, which then, because you are attached to an immortal soul, allows you to do spiritual things like intellectual functions, but again, things like prayer. And so yes, of course, there's a way in which those things are destructed, right? Deconstructed, but they are broken down to be to participate in a higher order of life. This is obviously the case when we get to the Eucharist, but even before we get there, this starts to be, this is the elemental way. All people, when we talk about the priesthood of all believers, the elemental Adam and Eve priesthood we all have is we take the material world and we transform it and offer it to the spiritual world. We primarily do this through eating. Yeah. This is why agriculture and husbandry is so tied to religious sentiments in nearly any culture, is we take the material world alone, of all things, and make it spiritual through our eating. And there's no way around that. And so eating is sacrificial. And when you begin to think of that, Bud, I think this idea of sacrifice being important, but also how skin in the game starts to get involved. Yeah. That you can eat in a rapacious way that ends up destroying an area, but there's also a sort of ecological way, to put it in one sense, a symbiotic way, right, that we begin to eat that actually doesn't ruin the land. And that's where I think you start to get sacrifice and skin in the game that makes sense.
Well, and I think what ties a lot of this together is the idea of covenant, because so often in Scripture, the sacrifice is made to seal a covenantal bond. And we've talked on the show recently about how covenant, we need to be careful not to flatten out this idea. It's not simply a contract. It establishes this sort of divine human relationship. You think about today, like the sacraments, how they shine forth these ideas, whether that be marriage or the week-to-week, day-to-day celebration of the Eucharist. But this is where, we don't capture this language perfectly in English, but in the Hebrew, you hear this language of God cut a covenant with so-and-so. And it starts with circumcision, but there are all sorts of really arresting portrayals in the Old Testament of God establishing this covenant as a sort of foreshadowing of what took place at Calvary. I know one we were bandying about before the show started was Genesis 15. And what's cool about this one is that, so Abraham, you can kind of sense in the Genesis narrative that he has doubts about God's fidelity in the light of what he's calling him to. There's the famous story of his wife laughing in her old age when she hears she's going to conceive. But God, in reaffirming the covenant with Abraham on this occasion, there's this account of how God asked Abraham to prepare various sacrifices. I believe I know there are birds.
Yeah.
Can't recall all the animals, but they cut the animals in half.
Yeah.
And then set up this sort of walkway where the carcasses are cut in half. There's one side of the animal on one side and another on the other. And then normally during this kind of covenantal ceremony, both parties would walk through it. And the idea is that they would get a visible image of, if I violate my side of the covenant, let it be done unto me what happened to these animals.
Yeah.
Well, at the moment where the covenant is going to be sealed, it says that the Lord actually puts Abraham into a deep sleep. It's the kind of sleep that Adam experienced when God created the woman. And then God, as a torch of light, passes through the animals on his own. And the clear takeaway from the passage is that God is promising Abraham, wherever life might lead you, I am the one who will fulfill this covenant that I'm now making with all of your future descendants. And so you see the importance of covenant insofar as it relates to the idea of sacrifice.
Well, and then, of course, this leads us, so we get from Abraham being willing to offer Isaac and God intervening with the propitiatory sacrifice of a ram, that God himself offers his son as propitiatory sacrifice for us and allows him, as it were, to go through with it, knowing, right, that he would be resurrected. And we start to see, again, these connections about that the Eucharist is this perpetual way that Christ extends both this sacrifice, but also, as you said, the covenant of the sacrifice. Yeah. So when we begin to talk about skin in the game, it is on one hand, and I think this is repeating something we said, God provides, so we call it flesh in the game, right? It's sacramental, but his body and blood, soul and divinity through the sacramental species of the host in every place that the church exists, that still is being offered as a sign of the seal of the covenant, a covenant that we couldn't ultimately fulfill our part, but God himself takes on the skin, the flesh of humanity to fulfill, as it were, both sides of the covenant.
Well, in tracking back to leadership, we have to find ways to manifest this in our own lives. Like we talked last week about skin in the game more in the colloquial sense. Here in Genesis 15, we see the Lord passing through the sacrifice like on his own as a sign to Abraham. But we talked last week about how so often leaders are sort of like nudging their followers into battle from behind, And so I don't know exactly what that always looks like. I think in the church, it's great that we have rituals that are ready-made. A lot of times vestments will bear the sign of the cross, and when the priest approaches the altar, I hope it's a really tangible reminder to our priest about what they're being called to. Like if we're going to say they stand in persona Christi, think about all the connotations of that in relation to what we're talking about with sacrifice.
And I think that starts to be, when we are making some of these connections that we've said so far, it is certainly the case that, I think there are some people that overuse Christian leaders and followers should be like a covenant. And almost always, I'm afraid to say that there's people a bit too willing to not follow our Lord's words, that what he said to the Pharisees, that you bind things that you yourself will not carry. I think the most intense reality of the covenant, if we understand Jesus Christ as coming and fulfilling part of the covenant that we couldn't fulfill, is it's absolutely the case that leaders and their followers, as it were, cut a particular covenant. But sometimes that is literal contracts when it comes to being employed.
Yeah.
But in the larger sense, what we want to say is, I will do these things as a leader, and I will provide these capacities for you, and you will do this work, and this work is X, Y, or Z, and this is considered good work, this is considered unfulfilled work. In some ways, that's only just being just in leadership, is to say, we have expectations, and we should expect them from each other, and if we don't quite get them, we're going to talk about it, etc. But I think that it's very important to say that Christ himself came as a judgment against leaders who tried to get the upside of a covenant and avoid the risk of a covenant. So back to what we said with skin in the game last week. And there's even a way that I'll be even bold to say some of the religious leaders of the time Christ interpreted as misidentifying his Father as a leader that's like that as well. That God, as it were, has all the expectation, but what does God risk, bud, right? So God is eternal. God is beyond, our realm. If God can't be injured by what we do, isn't it the fact that when God makes a covenant with man, he makes all the risk fall on mankind and avoids risk himself? And the incarnation is the answer to say absolutely the opposite. God himself not only takes on the risk, bud, he takes on the risk we rightly should have to face, and he allows it to be thrown on his back. His flesh is, beaten with stripes. He is scourged at the pillar. He faces our temptations. He dies in order to be resurrected, in order to complete both sides of the covenant. So when we talk about sacrificial leadership, when we talk about leadership that has skin in the game, of course, we're not trying to say that there's this perfect analogy between the passion and resurrection of Jesus Christ and every leader. But certainly, that is the beacon of which all leaders should try to imagine, in what way can I live up to the covenant of employment, of volunteering, of being, in the position to be a superior to someone who's underneath me? How do I begin to look like I will sacrifice and put my skin in the game, not only from what I should in my due portion, but on behalf of the person that I'm leading, so that this communion, which I think is what we'll talk about in the second half, that this communion can be made complete. And this is what we mean when we talk about the sacrificial leadership that looks like the true Christian understanding of skin in the game. When we get back, we're going to continue on this idea. There's plenty to talk about. For instance, sacrifice, the foundation of communities. We haven't even talked about eating dinners together, bud, and it's going to be a big deal. And we will continue that. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We are back talking about the Leadership Reconsidered module series. I like that better. We were talking about sacrifice and skin in the game. So, in the first segment, Bud, we got a chance to really get into what we mean by why the theology of sacrifice is important enough for Christian leadership to ground what we mean by skin in the game, that Jesus himself showed the ultimate skin in the game by willing to be sacrificed on the cross. But even into Old Testament sacrifice or sacrificial theology in general, the idea of being willing to offer up the best one has for the sake of something that's higher than that very thing is sort of elemental to the understanding of skin in the game. If you're not willing, as it were, to put your own self, which should be at least one of the top 10 precious things in your life, I would assume, Bud, if you're not willing to make a sacrifice of it for the sake of something higher, nothing will get accomplished. If you're not willing to have some discomfort in running, you're never going to get in shape. If you're not willing to give up some of your time in order to learn, you'll never become smart. And then, of course, this is on the biggest level, again, with Jesus Christ himself showing his willingness to do that. When it comes to leaders, Bud, if they're unwilling to put in parts of themselves that share the risk, right? So it's not enough just to avoid risk or even to share in the upside of decisions. How is it that leaders are willing to put themselves underneath the weight of the risk of others themselves, that they're in that together? But then, Bud, we want to say that there's a real way that sacrifice creates communities, and that might be the next thing we're going here. We brought up, for instance, that eating in some ways is the primary sacrificial way that all humans, do something sacrificial. They sacrifice living entities of material in order to consume them, to have the energy to then do spiritual things, intellectual, spiritual, etc. And that the Eucharist in some way, that the same principle about why it is that we eat the flesh and drink the blood of Jesus Christ sacramentally in the host, in the elements, is so important to us. It's because we also believe that there's a real way in which meals, sacrificial meals particularly, create communities. Shout out to our good friend Matthew Umbarger, right, who's done a lot of scholarly work on this point. But I don't think it's all for naught to say, so like the whole payoff of this here isn't be like, so have pizza with your underlings every so often. That's not what we're trying to get at. But there is this sort of way that your sacrifice as a leader, if done correctly, is the sort of sacrifice that sets the table for the community to actually have a sort of common thing. I do actually think meals come up more than people. That is something we should think about, is what it means to like sit down for a meal with people. And I'm even in like families, this is really important, obviously. Things like the military, they take that sort of seriously. Maybe there's something missing in our sort of economic and business life where we've lost this. But I just want to really do say that the sacrificial ability to create a community is something that leaders often don't understand, Bud, that certain sacrifice they make that people can see as being covenantal, as you pointed out, really do create the community of a shared goal and purpose.
Well, salvation history begins and ends with a meal. It's through eating that our first parents fell, and then the Bible looks forward to the end of time where there will be the wedding feast of the Lamb. And meals are culture forming. I think what you're pointing out here, Bo, is so right, that it's partly because sacrifice is at the center of it. And we do, I think, have a real loss in our culture by the fact that, a lot of families don't have that as a regular habit today to eat together. I'm always struck at the celebration of the Eucharist, which of course is a sacred meal, that, a lot of times when human beings gather to eat, there's a real hierarchy that's based on sort of like your status in society.
Right.
At the celebration at the altar, everyone from all walks of life come forward to receive from the same bountiful harvest, the divine gifts, which are in a certain sense like infinite and abundant and overflowing. And so it's sort of it kind of destabilizes the way that we normally think about those things. And that's where, I'm trying to think back, Bo. I think the first time we recorded this episode, we talked about the difference between sacrificial leadership and transactional leadership.
Yep.
That sort of idea that if you come to the table, or if you come to like a restaurant and someone out of their largesse sort of like gives you a free meal, we naturally sort of like bristle against that idea. Whereas like a truly like family meal has this kind of like democratization in the best sense of the word, that everyone comes as they are, they receive from the same gifts, they're oriented towards the same end. That transactional idea of leadership is so different. And I like probably the worst example that I've seen with this is I had a time in my life where a boss sort of acted like your paycheck it flowed from him.
Emanated.
There was this business organization, like we're all working together, but it was sort of like, well, it's something that I meet out, and then you take care of these menial tasks, or you do this that you might not want to do, because there's this sort of reward at the end of the process. Whereas sacrificial leadership, to me, like there's a real contrast in that it's not the meeting out of goods, but it's self-gift.
Yes.
That the person who's calling you to these ends is also intimately involved in this shared goal.
And I mean, there's two main things as cautions I want to immediately talk about here, which I think it's important enough to stop and say what we're not trying to do. And sometimes, but I think the first time we ran through, maybe we missed this. On one hand, what we're not trying to say is, man, everybody needs to be like a really close family, or otherwise this isn't. Because look, let's be honest, in the business world, what you do is I can do a service, I am going to be remunerated for it, right. And whatever else an administrator or a boss is, the idea is the coordination of multiple people with talents that can do good to the company, make strategic decisions because, seemingly they would have a perspective that other people don't have. So I'm not trying to go, you all have to be best friends. What I will say, though, is it's vastly different to imagine and say humans have gifts that they can give. They can give gifts of themselves, right? They have talents, treasures, capacities, and that it doesn't mean we can't understand. You can be just a person at a job. I want to get my paycheck. I don't want to have to do trust falls or stuff. I totally get it. But there is a way to say, in the basic dignity of I'm leading you and you are my employee, for instance. This works for other things as well. Is I go, you have a gift that you can offer, which is your capacities, which is what you have. And in order, you should be remunerated. I should pay you at a just wage. But fundamentally, instead of thinking like you have a good that I want to purchase, I want to say I want to remunerate you for your gift of yourself and your talents towards this common goal. We don't have to all wear matching sweaters at Christmas or have office parties even to make that fundamental shift. And I think that is a shift in the understanding the dignity that we both bring to the table. In a similar way, what I don't want to say is, the Eucharist is really cool. Let's just make an allegory of the Eucharist for work. But you didn't know it was going to happen today. But one more time, I want to bring up the great debate between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, because I actually think it applies here. Famously enough, C.S. Lewis loved allegories and was like, a lion is Jesus, right? It was like 1 = 1. Yeah. Tolkien, his buddy, was very uncomfortable with this. People would always try to allegories like, well, is the ring the nuclear bomb? Is this person that? And he refused, because what he wanted to say is when you have the truth of the gospel, what it allows for is what he calls subcreation. And that's a very different discussion to get into how that works in literature. But the idea is to say, because of the reality of Christ, you can have subcreative, imaginative worlds that participate in that without being one-to-one allegories. So, Bud, hear us all very clearly say, we do not believe that there's an allegory. Work is like the sacrifice of the Mass or communion. What we're saying is, because of Christ's sacrifice, because of the enduring sacrifice of the Mass, we are able to imagine leaders being sacrificially oriented towards the good of the company and towards their employees, their followers, because of what Christ did. So you do not, there will not be a time in your life as a leader where you go, that's when I was on the cross. and that's when I was resurrected. You don't have to demand that of your employees, but what you say is because the ground on how we understand the relationship of something like a leader and a follower, because of Christ, but we can imagine it very different way. And what we can say is leaders should be sacrificial, and that's not simply transactional. It's not just a distribution or exchange of goods. It is a self-gift. And just like an employee gives the self-gift of their talent, which we remunerate them for with a just wage so that they can raise a family, we as leaders should give our gift of self for the benefit of those who follow us and for the organization as a whole.
No, that's really good. And when you were talking about the first part about the way sometimes people blur these lines, I was thinking about some of the classic bits in the show The Office.
Yes.
Michael Scott, the manager, he consistently sort of tries to see the company as his family, and it leads to all sorts of shenanigans. He expects to receive invitations that probably need it not come. He sort of assumes central roles at his employees' weddings when he's, just sort of a bit player. And on top of that, there are times where he kind of has this elevated understanding of what your job asks for you beyond remuneration. And so when he's choosing the next manager, he tries to orchestrate this whole walking on hot charcoals ceremony to see who has the fortitude or whatever. And so there is a real danger there. And I think that's where you're saying there's not a one-to-one analogy, and if people are hearing that, it's a misunderstanding. I think even pressing that point a bit further, you think about the different sort of spheres we have in life. That's not the right term exactly, but I'm a father, I'm a Catholic, I work at Mercy College of Health Sciences, and if I took husband Bud and tried to insert him into Mercy College of Health Sciences, it would be creepy and weird and lead to all sorts of I'm going to stand in front of the church community with Rachel, my bride, and pronounce these vows. And that level of relationship demands that sort of commitment.
Yes.
In the work environment, what commitment and self-giving looks like are completely different.
Correct.
And to try to ape what you do at home in the workplace is it's going to lead you astray. That being said, that self-gift will look like, and I'm going to draw on the educational context, when a student is upset and they have a concern, you want the deans to be on the front lines with the faculty.
Correct.
When a mistake is made and even fiscally or whatever, things are out of whack, if a leader is willing to own, I could have done something to prevent that, that's sort of having skin in the game that's appropriate to the work context.
Absolutely. And so this is where people you don't want a boss at a job who's a dad or a general. Conversely, you don't want a dad who's a general or a boss. And you don't want a general who's a dad or a boss. I mean, all of these things, right? This is to say that prudence formulates what this incarnationally looks like, so that makes enough sense. But because of Christ's sacrifice and his continuous presence to us in the sacrifice of the Mass, we are enabled, Bud. We are empowered. We are given the capacity to live self-gift as leaders under a different kingdom, a different regime, than just a utilitarian one, just a distributory one, just a transactional one. And I think one of the ways this plays out, this is a theme that we're going to talk about again and again. Leaders often think their job is institutional preservation.
Yeah.
But, you look at what Christ did, and he was willing, he didn't go I'm going to go die because that's the only way that the temple is left standing. That famously, Bud, one of the contentions in the entire drama of Passion Week is him to say that the temple will not stand because he makes the prophetic prediction that he does.
Yeah.
He's more than willing to say that the preservation of the system is not 0.1 through 100 of what he's doing, but he is willing to risk everything through that self-gift so that the point of the temple, the point that the system even created, the point of the law, the point of the Decalogue was for the sake of humanity alive with God himself, and he is willing to do that sacrifice, not just to make something survive, but for the actual higher point, as it were, that the whole shooting match was there in the first place.
It wasn't until we did this series that I recognized how much the temptation of institutional preservation shows up in the Gospels. So you already mentioned the temple and the way that the disciples at one point, they're really impressed with like the magnificence of the structure. And Christ reminds them that not a stone will be left unturned. Peter, I don't think it's a bad impulse, but on the Mount of Transfiguration, he wants to build booths to sort of like preserve the moment or the event. And Christ reminds them that they're already on the pathway to the cross. And so, in the Gospels themselves, I think our Lord is giving various warnings to say, what I'm about to accomplish is not solely it can't be distilled down to institutional preservation. Now, it's fascinating, as he's having those conversations, he does talk about a new temple, and St. John, has that famous interpolation that he's talking about the temple of his body. And so that really, I think that starts to drive at the heart of self-gift, because as Christ is giving of himself even before the passion, it's all driving towards this moment where there would be a new community, like a newly constituted community, but that could only come about not through a fixation on institutional preservation, but on self-gift.
And I think that goes into then for something else that we've talked about before and we'll talk about again, that sacrificial leadership will look a lot different than people-pleasing. It seems like one way you can maybe flatten out sacrifice is like, oh, well, I make people happy, so I'm not going to choose what I want to do because I'm going to make sure to do what they want to do. But this gets into this danger of like a hidden self-protection, right? If you want to avoid conflict, funny enough, the very thing that led to, let's point out, Christ's sacrifice on the cross was his unwillingness to please people because he had an unwillingness to preserve himself. So the question is not, are people pleased, but like, have I poured myself out in such a way that even if I face resistance, that not everybody's happy with what I do, that I haven't done so through self-assertion, but then I am willing to face the flack of doing something unpopular because I know that I've listened to people, I've taken that into account, but I can't please everyone. But that's not to say that not dismissively, bud. To be willing to put yourself in that sort of risk.
Well, this one hits home for me because by nature, I'm more non-confrontational, and so I think when I first got married, if I get a little personal for a moment on air, Bo, I thought like a happy marriage is just avoiding all conflict, right? If you never have that conflict boil over, then things must be good to go. Anyone who's walked for a time in a relationship like that knows that's not the case, that there's a need for crucial conversations, in family life, marriage, and certainly at work. This, as we're just like several days removed from Easter, I can't help but think about Pontius Pilate. Like in the Passion narratives, you see these various figures and you kind of look at them and say, like, where do I fit into all this? Like, how I have responded to Christ's arrest and his passion. And with Pilate, I know he's a figure who there have been various takes on like how culpable was he. I think there have been some Christians who had a kind of devotion to Pontius Pilate. But at the end of the day, I would say like the washing of the hands is this kind of avoidance of conflict. It's punting at a crucial moment. And
sorry, Iowa Hawkeyes.
Yeah. Punting is not winning in that case.
Yeah.
The Passion of the Christ, I rewatched that again recently, and I think Gibson captured that moment really well. When you see it is about lordship. Who is Lord? Is it Caesar or is it Christ? Pilate tries to offer Barabbas, and watching that film, reading the Gospels, you realize the amount of pressure and the crushing burden that he felt to sort of appease the crowd and find a way to eject himself from this situation.
So on that one, like you said, as growing older, being a parent longer, having fallen into weird leadership positions I didn't expect, I know I've pulled that one off. Like I would hope that I'm not like Pontius Pilate. One I've definitely pulled off, bud, is like that time where you're a leader and you're like, oh, I've come up with the perfect solution that like, of course they'll take this path and then this can all go away. And then you walk out the solution and everybody chooses the exact thing. You're like, well, there's no way they'll choose this. Yeah. They'll choose. And I can just imagine how everyone interiorly in the Roman camp groaned when everyone's like, we'll take Barabbas. Because don't you know, but he's like, well, there's no way they'll do this. Yeah. And how many times have leaders, like as a parent, I'm like, oh, yeah, well, I'll offer the kid this. No way they'll take that. Kid takes it. And you're like, oh, wow, I have multiplied my problems. And I think the parent analogy sort of gets at this too. We have to show our kids love, but we don't have to, we shouldn't seek approval. But conversely, a kid shouldn't have to seek approval in terms of like always being in the good graces of their parents, but like they should seek to love their parents, which is to say, yes, they're going to have to grow, they make mistakes, but like they have to trust that a parent loves them, and the parent has to earn this, to say, when I finally as a kid go, okay, I'll listen to mom and dad even though I don't want to, that is because of like the trust that I know that they love me, and even if I don't see clearly right now why they're doing this, I'm going to do so. And conversely, that's what a parent should do, is not to be like approved by children or not to be their kids' friends. But some people say that, and I think sometimes they're too rough about it. This is just to say, I have to show that even when I disagree and make my kid do something they don't want to do, that there's a fundamental understanding that I do this out of love, even if my decision happens to be wrong and I have to apologize for it as a parent, which can happen. I need to show that I made that decision out of love and not just out of self-preservation, trying to get approval from the kids, or just trying to hurry along them growing up, for instance.
Well, this is where I think parenting, when God calls individual Catholics to this sort of thing, it's a real laboratory for leadership, because parenting is an identity. Like being a father is something that's sort of given to you. We've talked about the danger of leaders who kind of want to seize power or seek out leadership, but that's something that we receive. And this goes back all the way to our Lord Jesus Christ was the Son of God. From the earliest of ages, he knew that he had a special calling, that he had a mission. And this is where he didn't refuse power, but he embodied it in this self-sacrificial manner. There's a real art to that. It's so hard to pull off in the day-to-day experience of life. We could probably do a whole series on mistakes that we've made as leaders. But I think true leadership like this is kind of an identity that's sort of given and received. It's not seized or grasped at and then embraced in a self-sacrificial manner. That's where we start to see it really shine forth as something different than so often the world thinks about these things.
Yeah, that's the last thing I'll point out as we bring up Gregory the Great's going to show up a lot in this series. And famously, the legend says, he actually tried to escape Rome because he didn't want to be made pope. They hunted him down, found him, and installed him. And Bud, that's one thing. It's like, oh, it's kind of a quirky thing. We go like, oh, that's what you want as a leader who doesn't want to be a leader. But what I want to like say, in the positive sense, Gregory the Great knew the great sacrifice it would mean to be a pope, but a bigger deal, to remain a saint as a pope, which is what he wanted to be, right? As he wanted to be holy. And so he didn't find himself worthy at first, and so he tried to abscond himself. And when God said, no, this is your path to holiness, he said yes, which was this massive sacrifice, because all he wanted, which was to be in his monastery. And that's what we mean by skin in the game as sacrificial leadership. More to come a little bit after we're done with this. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, Reconsidered Leadership, talking about skin in the game and sacrificial theology, and about how that informs what it means to be a kenotic, a self-emptying leader. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. We are, of course, very appreciative. And in this season of Easter, we want to say thank you to all of the business sponsors that make Iowa Catholic Radio possible. Many Easter blessings to all of you. But one more time, thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for making The Uncommon Good possible. Bud, I'm always sometimes worried that we bite off more than we can chew. Sacramental theology, of course, is a massive thing. To try to apply it to leadership, maybe even bigger deal. But I think that people see how this starts to thread through all of the things we've spoken of so far.
No, great conversation about sacrifice. It is kind of nice to be in the season of Eastertide where penitential sacrifices are a little bit less than they've been recently. But every part of the church calendar, please do join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We pray the Rosary on air at 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., 8:30 in the evening. You can also pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:57 in the afternoon, or jump on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
We are in the Easter season indeed, and we're very thankful for all that our Lord has done for us. We are an Easter people, and folks, we're trying to spread the Easter message. 21 years of doing that on Iowa Catholic Radio, 10 years here with the Uncommon Good, only made possible by your prayers, by your donations of your time, but also your treasure. And folks, we want to say thank you for everyone who gives, but this ministry is not just the folks behind the microphones, the boards, or the desks. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible by calling 515-223-1150 or going to iowacatholicradio.com to safely and securely donate there. But as always, happy Easter. He is risen.
He is risen indeed. Alleluia.
Alleluia. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.